An elderly veteran sat quietly in a crowded Chicago subway station, just trying to stay warm in his wheelchair. Then 3 arrogant, drunk businessmen walked by. They shoved him, spilled scalding coffee all over his chest, and laughed at him like he was nothing. And the worst part? Hundreds of commuters watched, but nobody stepped in to help. They all looked away in fear. But what those 3 bullies did not realize was that a Navy SEAL had been standing in the shadows the entire time. A man trained to protect the weak. And when the businessmen demanded the old man to apologize, they had absolutely no idea who they were about to face. The winter wind howled through the entrance of the Chicago subway station. It carried the bitter cold of December down the concrete stairs. Rush hour had arrived. Hundreds of commuters flooded the underground platform. They moved in thick crowds. Briefcases swung. Heavy winter coats brushed against one another. Shoes tapped a frantic rhythm against the hard floor. Everyone had a destination. Everyone moved with purpose. The station echoed with the metallic screech of arriving trains and the muffled voice of the intercom announcer. In a dim corner near a concrete pillar, Samuel sat completely still. He was an elderly man, frail in build but anchored by a quiet strength. Deep lines carved his weathered face. His silver hair sat neatly under a faded wool cap. He wore an old olive-green jacket. The patches on the shoulders had faded long ago. Samuel sat in a manual wheelchair. The empty space where his legs used to be was covered by a thick plaid blanket. Despite his physical condition, his eyes remained sharp. They were the color of cold steel, observing the chaotic world around him with steady focus. He held a paper cup of coffee in both hands. The warmth seeped through the cardboard into his calloused fingers. His hands trembled slightly, a permanent reminder of age and past physical tolls. Yet he held the cup firmly. He took a slow sip. The dark liquid offered a small comfort against the freezing drafts that swept through the tunnel. Samuel watched the sea of people passing by. He noticed their quick steps. He saw the strength in their strides. Sometimes looking at them brought back memories. He remembered a time when his own legs carried him with that same effortless power. He remembered the heavy boots, the grueling marches, the dirt, and the sweat of his youth. He had once been a man of action. He had run toward danger when others ran away. Those days felt like a distant dream now. The transition from a strong soldier to a silent observer in a wheelchair had not been easy. But Samuel had learned to accept his reality. He did not ask for pity. He only asked for a small space in the world to exist peacefully. People walked past him without looking down. Some adjusted their path slightly to avoid his chair. Most simply did not see him at all. In a city of millions, a quiet old man in a corner was invisible. Samuel did not mind the isolation. Over the years, he had built a quiet fortress within his mind. The indifference of strangers no longer hurt him. He found a strange rhythm in the chaos of the station. He liked watching the trains arrive and depart. He liked the brief moments of silence between the crowds. Another train roared into the station. The doors slid open. A massive wave of passengers poured out. They merged with the crowd waiting on the platform. The noise level rose to a deafening roar. Samuel leaned back against the cold concrete pillar. He closed his eyes for a moment. He let the sounds wash over him. The rush of air from the train ruffled the collar of his jacket. He tightened his scarf. Then, a different kind of noise broke through the mechanical sounds of the station. It was loud, sharp, and out of place. It was the sound of harsh laughter. Samuel opened his eyes. He looked down the platform. The crowd parted slightly, moving out of the way of the disturbance. 3 men were walking toward him. They wore expensive, tailored suits. Their coats were unbuttoned despite the cold. Their silk ties hung loosely around their necks. They moved with a reckless, stumbling energy. The scent of strong alcohol reached Samuel before they did. The men were clearly intoxicated. They had likely left a corporate holiday party or a long afternoon at a high-end bar. They spoke loudly, their voices echoing off the tiled walls. They did not care who heard them. They did not care who they bumped into. The man in the center seemed to be the leader. He was tall, with slicked-back dark hair and a heavy flush on his cheeks. He carried a leather briefcase in one hand, swinging it carelessly. He laughed at a joke one of his companions made, throwing his head back. His laughter was not joyful. It sounded mocking and cruel. The two men beside him were equally loud. One was heavier, with a red face and an unbuttoned collar. The other was thin, holding a half-empty bottle wrapped in a brown paper bag. They bumped shoulders, pushing each other playfully, taking up the entire width of the walking path. Commuters quickly stepped aside. Mothers pulled their children closer. Businesswomen diverted their eyes and walked faster. No one wanted to engage with three drunk, aggressive men. The crowd instinctively created a clear path for them. Unfortunately, that path led directly to the corner where Samuel sat. Samuel did not move. He had nowhere to go. His wheelchair was backed up against the pillar. He gripped his coffee cup a little tighter. He kept his face blank. He had encountered men like this before. He knew the best strategy was to remain invisible. He lowered his gaze to his blanket. He hoped they would simply walk past him. But the tall man in the center stopped. His expensive leather shoes scuffed to a halt just a few feet from the wheelchair. The other two men stopped behind him, swaying slightly. The tall man looked down. His glassy eyes focused on Samuel. A twisted smile slowly formed on his face. The ambient noise of the station seemed to fade into the background. Samuel kept his eyes focused on his cup. He could feel the heavy, oppressive presence of the three men looming over him. The cold draft swept past them, carrying the smell of expensive cologne mixed with cheap liquor. The peaceful isolation Samuel had enjoyed just moments ago vanished completely. The tall man nudged his heavier friend. He pointed a finger at the old wheelchair. He whispered something, and the heavy man snorted with laughter. The thin man took a sip from his paper bag and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. They stood there like predators who had just found an easy target. Samuel remained completely still. He focused on his breathing, in and out, slow and steady. He knew the next few moments would test his patience. The station announcer's voice cracked over the loudspeaker again, but Samuel did not hear the words. He only heard the harsh, uneven breathing of the men standing right in front of him. The final train of the hour was approaching, but right now, time had stopped in this dark corner. The three men did not alter their course. The tall leader walked with a heavy, uneven stride. He looked over his shoulder to laugh at a comment from the thin man. He did not watch the path ahead. The station lights reflected off his slick hair and his polished shoes. He swung his leather briefcase in a wide arc. Samuel braced himself. He pushed his back hard against the concrete pillar. He tried to pull his wheelchair further into the shadows, but the corner offered no escape route. The wheels pressed against the wall. He had nowhere else to retreat. He tightened his grip on his coffee cup and lowered his chin. The tall man took another blind step backward. His expensive leather shoe caught the front metal footrest of the wheelchair. The collision was sudden and violent. The force of the man's heavy frame slammed into the chair. The metal frame groaned. The chair jerked sharply to the side. Samuel lost his balance. His hands instinctively tightened around the paper cup to keep it from falling. The frail cardboard crushed instantly under the pressure. The plastic lid popped off. Scalding hot coffee burst out of the cup. It splashed directly onto Samuel's chest. The dark liquid soaked rapidly into the worn fabric of his olive-green jacket. It cascaded down onto the plaid blanket covering his missing legs. A sharp, intense heat bit into Samuel's skin. The coffee burned through his layers of clothing. Samuel gasped, but he clamped his jaw shut immediately. He refused to let out a cry of pain. He closed his eyes tight. The burning sensation spread across his chest and stomach. He had endured far worse pain in his life. He remembered the heat of desert sands and the sharp agony of shrapnel. He forced his breathing to slow down. He willed his body to absorb the shock in silence. He opened his eyes. The front of his jacket was ruined. A dark, steaming stain covered his chest. The smell of roasted coffee beans mixed heavily with the stench of alcohol from the men. Samuel let the crushed, empty cup drop to the floor. His hands shook violently now. The tremor was a mix of his old age, the sudden adrenaline, and the searing heat against his skin. He reached into his coat pocket. His clumsy fingers searched frantically for a napkin or a handkerchief. He pulled out a single, crumpled tissue. He pressed it against his wet jacket. The thin paper dissolved almost immediately against the heavy spill. It was completely useless. The station around them seemed to freeze. The loud murmur of the crowd died down for a few seconds. Dozens of commuters witnessed the collision. A businesswoman holding a yoga mat stopped in her tracks. A young student wearing large headphones pulled them down around his neck. They all saw the frail old man in the wheelchair get hit. They all saw the hot coffee spill over his chest. Yet no one stepped forward. The instinct to help warred with the fear of the drunk, wealthy men. The tall man and his friends looked unpredictable and aggressive. In a busy city, self-preservation often won. The businesswoman looked away and walked faster toward the turnstiles. The student put his headphones back on and stared at his phone. The crowd collectively decided to remain blind. They stepped back. They created a wider circle around the incident. They left Samuel entirely alone to face the consequences. The tall man stumbled from the impact. He caught his balance just before falling. He dropped his briefcase to the floor with a loud thud. He looked down at his polished leather shoes. A few drops of coffee had splashed onto the tips. He wiped them frantically on the back of his trouser leg. Samuel kept dabbing at his ruined jacket with his bare hands. He wiped the hot liquid away from his neck. He waited for the inevitable apology. He expected the man to turn around, realize his mistake, and offer a simple word of regret. A brief, "Excuse me," or "I am sorry," would have ended the matter. Samuel would have nodded and accepted it. But the tall man did not apologize. He spun around. His face flushed a deep, angry red. His eyes narrowed as he looked down at Samuel. The man did not see a disabled veteran who had just been burned. He only saw an obstacle. He only saw a filthy old man taking up space in his world. "What is wrong with you?" the tall man shouted. His voice echoed off the concrete walls. It was harsh and commanding. Samuel stopped wiping his jacket. He looked up. His steel blue eyes met the angry, bloodshot eyes of the businessman. Samuel did not speak. He maintained his stoic expression. "Are you blind, old man?" the tall man continued, taking a threatening step closer. "You just ruined my shoes. You are blocking the entire walkway with this massive piece of junk." He kicked the wheel of the chair lightly to emphasize his point. The heavy man stepped up beside him. He pointed a thick finger at Samuel. "Look at him. He probably sat here on purpose to beg for change. Hey, buddy, if you want money for a new coffee, get a job." The thin man with the paper bag let out a loud, hacking laugh. "He cannot even hold a cup right. Look at his hands shake," the tall man sneered. He looked at Samuel's trembling hands. then at the empty space beneath the plaid blanket. The cruelty in his eyes deepened. "Pathetic," he muttered loudly. "People like you should not be allowed to clutter up the station during rush hour. You are a public nuisance." Samuel gripped the armrests of his wheelchair. His knuckles turned white. The hot coffee cooled quickly in the freezing draft of the station, turning icy and uncomfortable against his skin. The physical pain faded, replaced by a deep, familiar sting of humiliation. He had sacrificed his legs for the freedom of this country. He had bled on foreign soil so men like these could walk through life with safety and arrogance. He stared at the tall man. He did not break eye contact. He refused to show fear. He sat in his wet, ruined clothes and absorbed their insults. He knew that any word he spoke would only fuel their drunken anger. Silence was his only weapon. The tall man crossed his arms. He enjoyed the power he held over the helpless old man. He looked around at the retreating crowd, taking their silence as validation. He turned back to Samuel, a cruel smile stretching across his face. "Clean yourself up," the tall man commanded. "You smell like a trash can." He picked up his briefcase, ready to walk away and leave the broken man behind. The heavy silence of the station pressed down on Samuel, suffocating and cold. The tall man stood with his hands on his hips. He waited for Samuel to speak. He wanted a reaction. He wanted fear or anger. He wanted an excuse to escalate the situation. The station platform around them grew painfully quiet. The loud rumble of the distant trains only highlighted the immediate silence of the crowd. Samuel looked at the spilled coffee on his lap. The dark liquid soaked deep into his plaid blanket. The icy draft of the Chicago winter blew through the tunnel. It turned the wet patches on his jacket freezing cold. He shivered slightly, but he quickly tightened his core muscles to stop it. He refused to give the tall man the satisfaction of seeing him physically uncomfortable. The thin man pointed at the puddle on the floor. "You need to mop that up," he slurred, swaying on his feet. He took another drink from his brown paper bag. "You are making a mess in a public place. They should call the police on you." The heavy man chuckled. He crossed his arms over his large stomach. "He cannot mop anything up. Look at him. He is half a man. He probably needs someone to feed him." The cruel words echoed loudly. Dozens of commuters stood in a wide circle around the scene. They watched with wide eyes. Some people whispered to each other. A young woman in a gray coat reached for her phone, but her boyfriend pulled her hand down. He shook his head. He mouthed the word no. Nobody wanted to get involved. The three businessmen wore expensive clothes. They carried an air of wealth and entitlement. The crowd calculated the risk and decided the old man in the wheelchair was not worth it. Samuel saw the young woman put her phone away. He felt a familiar ache in his chest. It was not anger at the crowd, it was a tired resignation. He understood their fear. The world favored the loud, the wealthy, and the physically strong. Samuel possessed none of those things anymore. He had lost his physical strength in a war zone decades ago. He had lost his wealth to medical bills. Now, he only had his quiet dignity. "Are you deaf?" the tall man demanded. He stepped closer. His expensive leather shoes squished slightly in the spilled coffee. "I am talking to you. Look at me when I speak to you." Samuel slowly raised his head. His eyes locked onto the tall man. His gaze held no panic. It held the cold, hard discipline of a soldier who had faced death and survived. Samuel remembered the screaming drill instructors of his youth. He remembered the deafening sound of mortar fire. The drunken shouting of a wealthy businessman meant nothing to him. "Nothing to say?" the tall man sneered. He leaned forward. His breath smelled heavily of stale whiskey and mint. "You think you are tough? You think sitting there in silence makes you better than us? You are nothing. You are a discarded piece of trash taking up space in my city." Samuel gripped the armrests of his wheelchair. His hands felt stiff and cold. The metal of the chair dug into his palms. He focused his energy on his grip. He channeled all his frustration and humiliation into his hands. He knew he could not win a physical fight. He had no legs. His arms lacked their former power. If he raised his voice, these men would likely tip his chair over. If he tried to defend himself, they would hurt him. Survival required silence. Survival required him to swallow his pride. The heavy man stepped forward and bumped his shoulder against the tall man. "Leave him alone, Richard. He is just a mute idiot. Let us go catch a cab. The train is too slow anyway." The tall man, Richard, shook his head. His pride was wounded by Samuel's defiant silence. He wanted the old man to cower. He wanted him to beg for forgiveness for ruining his shoe. The lack of a response infuriated him. "No," Richard said loudly. "I am tired of paying taxes so people like this can sit around and ruin our public spaces. Look at him staring at me. He thinks he has the right to judge me." Richard looked around the station. He saw the crowd watching him. He puffed out his chest, playing to the audience. He wanted to show everyone that he was in charge. He turned back to Samuel. The cruel smile vanished from his face. It was replaced by a look of pure disgust. "Move your junk out of my way," Richard commanded. Samuel did not move. He could not move. The wheels of his chair were pinned against the concrete pillar behind him. Richard saw the lack of movement. His face flushed deeper. He raised his right leg. He brought his expensive leather shoe back, and then he swung it forward. He kicked the large right wheel of Samuel's wheelchair. The kick landed with a sharp, metallic clang. The entire chair shuddered violently. Samuel jolted in his seat. His shoulders hit the hard concrete pillar behind him. The impact sent a sharp pain down his spine. The thin metal spokes of the wheel vibrated from the force of the blow. The crowd gasped. A few people took a step backward in shock. The invisible line had been crossed. It was no longer just verbal abuse, it had become physical. Richard planted his foot back on the ground. He glared at Samuel. "I said, move." Samuel tightened his jaw. He tasted a metallic hint of blood where he had accidentally bit his inner lip. The cold coffee soaked through to his skin. His back ached from hitting the pillar. Yet, he still did not make a sound. He stared at Richard, daring him to do it again. The tension in the air grew so thick it felt suffocating. The station waited for the next blow. Behind another concrete pillar, 15 feet away, a man stood quietly in the shadows. He had been there since the three businessmen first walked down the platform. He saw the careless collision. He saw the hot coffee spill over the frail old man. He heard every cruel, degrading word echoing through the station. His name was Connor. He was a Navy SEAL returning home on a rare 2-week leave. He wore a faded black canvas jacket, dark denim jeans, and heavy tactical boots. A massive, olive-drab military backpack hung securely over his broad shoulders. The pack weighed nearly 80 pounds, holding his gear and uniforms. Connor carried it as effortlessly as a normal man carried a winter coat. His face was deeply weathered from salt water and harsh desert suns. A short, neat beard lined his strong jaw. His dark eyes were calculating, sharp, and completely calm. Connor did not rush forward. He evaluated the situation with the cold precision of a trained military operator. He noted the three men. He registered their sloppy posture, their slurred speech, and their complete lack of situational awareness. He saw the expensive suits and the polished leather shoes. They were bullies. They picked on an elderly, disabled man because they felt absolutely safe doing it. They assumed the crowd would stay out of it. They assumed no one would stop them. Connor shifted his weight. He had spent the last 8 months in combat zones dealing with genuine, lethal threats. He had no tolerance for civilian cowards who abused the weak. He watched Richard, the tall leader, raise his right foot again. Richard prepared to deliver a second kick to the wheelchair. Before the expensive shoe could connect with the metal spokes, Connor moved. He stepped out from the shadows of the pillar. His heavy tactical boots struck the concrete floor with a deliberate, commanding rhythm. He did not run. He walked with a steady, inevitable pace. Each step landed firmly, echoing softly over the ambient noise of the station. He moved perfectly balanced, ready to pivot or strike in an instant. The crowd of onlookers noticed him immediately. They saw the sheer size of the man, the massive military backpack, and the deadly, unwavering focus in his eyes. The collective fear of the crowd shifted into awe. The sea of people parted without a single word spoken. Commuters stepped back quickly. They created a wide, clear path leading directly to the center of the conflict. Richard heard the approaching footsteps. The rhythmic thud sounded different from the frantic tapping of civilian shoes. He lowered his foot and turned his head. His arrogant, drunken smile faltered instantly. Connor walked straight toward the tall man. He did not stop until he stood exactly 2 feet away from Richard. Connor positioned his large frame squarely between the 3 businessmen and Samuel. He became a solid physical wall of muscle and canvas. He completely shielded the old man in the wheelchair from their view. Connor stood perfectly still. He did not cross his arms to look tough. He let his hands hang loosely at his sides, his fingers relaxed but ready. He stared directly into Richard's eyes. The height difference between the 2 men was minimal, but Connor's presence felt utterly massive. He projected an aura of absolute, terrifying control. Richard tried to maintain his tough exterior. He puffed out his chest, but his breathing grew noticeably shallow. He looked at Connor's broad shoulders, then glanced at the heavy military pack. The alcohol in Richard's system suddenly felt less like liquid courage and much more like a terrible mistake. "Excuse me," Richard said. His voice completely lacked the booming authority it held just moments ago. It cracked slightly at the edges. "You are in my way." Connor did not speak. He did not blink. He simply maintained the heavy lock on Richard's eyes. The silence he offered was entirely different from Samuel's silent endurance. Connor's silence was a weapon. It was a silent promise of immediate, overwhelming violence if Richard made a single wrong move. The heavy man, sensing the massive shift in power, took a slow step backward. He bumped into the thin man, who nearly dropped his paper bag of alcohol. The playful, arrogant energy of the trio evaporated completely. The freezing winter draft swept through the station tunnel again, and this time the 3 businessmen felt the bitter chill. "Hey, buddy," the heavy man stammered. He raised his hands in a weak, placating gesture. "We are just having a conversation here. Mind your own business." Connor shifted his gaze to the heavy man for exactly 1 second. It was a cold, clinical assessment that stripped the man of any remaining confidence. Then Connor's eyes snapped rapidly back to Richard. The silent message was abundantly clear. They were not a threat. They were merely an annoyance. Behind Connor, Samuel looked up at the broad back of the stranger. He saw the worn tactical boots and the military pack. He immediately recognized the rigid, disciplined posture. It was the stance of a man who had stood on front lines. A wave of unexpected relief washed over Samuel's tired chest. For the first time in many years, he did not have to fight his battle alone. Richard swallowed hard. He felt the burning gaze of the entire station fixed upon him. He knew he could not back down now without looking like a complete coward in front of his friends and the crowd. He tried desperately to summon his previous anger. He pointed a shaking finger at Connor's chest. "Listen to me," Richard warned loudly, attempting to sound brave. "I do not know who you think you are, but you need to step aside right now. This filthy old man ruined my shoe." Connor looked down at Richard's extended finger. He did not swat it away. He did not raise his voice to match the businessman's shouting. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, deep, and perfectly steady. It rumbled like distant thunder over the mechanical noise of the subway tunnel. "Put your hand down." It was a simple, direct command. It contained no profanity. It contained no explicit threat. But the absolute, unwavering certainty in Connor's tone made Richard freeze entirely. Richard realized, with sudden and crystal clarity, that if he did not lower his hand immediately, the stranger would break it. Slowly, reluctantly, Richard lowered his arm. The tension in the station reached a boiling point. The invisible dynamic had completely shifted. The aggressive predator had just realized he was actually the prey. Richard's hand dropped slowly to his side. The movement was jerky and uncoordinated, betraying his sudden, intense panic. He stared up at the tall, broad-shouldered man blocking his path. The station around them remained eerily quiet. Only the distant metallic screech of a departing train broke the heavy silence. Connor did not blink. His dark eyes remained fixed on Richard's flushed face. He stood with his feet planted shoulder-width apart. The massive military backpack did not seem to affect his balance at all. He looked entirely comfortable in the tense, aggressive atmosphere. Connor had spent his career operating in environments where a single mistake meant death. A drunk, arrogant businessman in a subway station posed absolutely zero threat to him. "You hit his chair," Connor stated. His voice carried clearly over the ambient noise of the terminal. It lacked any trace of anger or excitement. It sounded entirely factual and chillingly calm. "You spilled hot coffee on him, then you kicked his chair." Richard opened his mouth to speak, but the words failed to form. He swallowed hard. The thick red flush of alcohol on his cheeks began to fade rapidly. It was replaced by a pale, sickly color. He glanced back at his two companions, desperately looking for support. The heavy man took a hurried step backward. He bumped hard into the thin man behind him. The thin man fumbled clumsily with his brown paper bag. The glass liquor bottle slipped through his fingers. It hit the concrete floor and shattered with a loud crash. The sharp smell of cheap alcohol instantly overpowered the scent of the spilled coffee. A few people in the crowd murmured and stepped further away from the puddle of broken glass. "We did not do anything wrong," Richard finally managed to say. His voice sounded remarkably thin and weak. He pointed a trembling finger at Samuel. "He was blocking the walkway. He is a public nuisance." Connor tilted his head a fraction of an inch. His expression remained entirely unreadable. "You have eyes. You saw him sitting here. You chose to walk directly into him." Behind Connor, Samuel watched the exchange silently. He felt the freezing cold draft against his wet chest, but the icy chill no longer bothered him. He focused his attention entirely on the young man standing in front of him. Samuel recognized the absolute stillness in Connor's posture. He recognized the way Connor controlled the entire space simply by occupying it. It was the undeniable mark of a highly trained, elite soldier. The sight brought back a sudden flood of memories from Samuel's own youth. He remembered standing shoulder to shoulder with men who possessed that exact same discipline. He felt a profound sense of pride swell in his chest. He was no longer fighting this battle alone. "Look," Richard stammered. He pulled on the lapels of his expensive suit jacket. He desperately wanted to regain some sense of authority. "I am a very important man in this city. I have places to be. I am not going to stand here and be lectured by some random street thug." Connor did not react to the insult. He simply analyzed Richard's physical state. He saw the trembling hands, the rapid breathing, and the darting, fearful eyes. Richard was terrified, but his pride kept him talking. "You are not going anywhere," Connor said smoothly. Richard bristled. His fragile ego flared up again. The humiliation of being dressed down in public pushed him to act tough. "You cannot keep me here. That is illegal. That is kidnapping." "I am not touching you," Connor pointed out softly. "I am simply standing here. If you want to walk away, walk away." Richard looked to his left. He looked to his right. The crowd of commuters had formed a solid, unmoving ring around the scene. No one stepped aside to let him pass. They stared at the three businessmen with undisguised contempt. Richard realized he was completely trapped. He could not physically move Connor. He could not push his way through the angry crowd. "What do you want?" Richard demanded. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Connor shifted his gaze for a moment. He looked down at the dark, wet coffee stain ruining Samuel's jacket, then looked back up to Richard. "There is a coffee kiosk at the top of the stairs," Connor said. His voice echoed like a judge handing down a final sentence. "You will walk up there. You will buy a large black coffee. You will bring it back down here. You will hand it to this gentleman, and you will look him directly in the eye and apologize." Richard stared at Connor in absolute disbelief. The demand sounded absurd to him. He was a wealthy corporate executive. He did not run errands for homeless-looking men in wheelchairs. He felt the eyes of the crowd burning into his skin. If he obeyed this stranger, he would look incredibly weak. He would become a joke to his friends. "I am not doing that," Richard sneered. He forced a fake, mocking laugh. "I am not buying anything for this filthy beggar." Connor took a single, deliberate step forward. He closed the distance between them effortlessly. He now stood mere inches from Richard's face. The physical intimidation was absolute and overwhelming. Richard recoiled instantly. He pressed his back hard against the heavy man behind him to escape Connor's proximity. "I am not asking you," Connor said. The quiet, even tone was far more terrifying than a shout. "I am telling you." The heavy man grabbed Richard's arm. "Just do it, Rich. Let us just get out of here. This guy is dangerous." Richard shook off his friend's hand violently. His pride refused to break. The alcohol in his system pushed him toward a deeply foolish decision. He reached quickly into his tailored suit jacket pocket. Connor's eyes tracked the movement instantly. His muscles coiled tight. If Richard pulled a weapon, Connor would drop him to the concrete floor before the weapon ever cleared the fabric. But Richard did not pull a weapon. He pulled out a sleek, expensive smartphone. His hand shook so badly he nearly dropped the device. He tapped the screen frantically with his thumb. "You think you can bully me?" Richard shouted. His voice rose in pitch, echoing loudly off the tiled walls. He held the phone up to his ear. "I am calling the station security right now. I know the captain here personally. I am having you arrested for assault and threatening behavior." The crowd groaned in collective disgust. They had all seen what truly happened. They knew Richard was lying. But Richard ignored them completely. He paced back and forth in his small space, holding the phone tightly to his head. Connor did not flinch. He did not try to snatch the phone away. He did not try to stop the call. He simply stood his ground, remaining a solid, protective wall between the arrogant businessman and the disabled veteran. He watched Richard speak rapidly into the phone, weaving a completely fabricated story about being physically attacked by a deranged man. Samuel looked up at Connor's broad back. He felt a sudden pang of worry for the young soldier. Samuel knew exactly how the civilian world worked. Wealthy men in expensive suits often won arguments against men in worn tactical boots, regardless of the actual truth. Samuel opened his mouth. He wanted to tell Connor to leave, to run away and save himself from the incoming legal trouble. But he looked at the resolute, unyielding line of Connor's jaw and remained silent. He knew a soldier like this would never abandon his post. Richard lowered his smartphone. He slipped it back into the pocket of his tailored suit jacket with a dramatic flourish. A smug, arrogant smile returned to his flushed face. He felt powerful again. The station security captain owed him a favor, or so he believed. He looked at Connor with triumphant eyes. "They are on their way," Richard announced loudly. He wanted the entire crowd to hear his victory. "You just made the biggest mistake of your miserable life. You are going to jail." Connor did not move a single muscle. He maintained his position. He stood squarely between the drunk men and Samuel. His dark eyes remained fixed on Richard, offering no reaction. The lack of fear irritated the wealthy businessman deeply. The heavy man behind Richard chuckled nervously. He patted Richard on the shoulder. "Good call, Rich. Let the cops handle this guy. He is crazy." The thin man nodded, staring down at the shattered glass and spilled liquor at his own feet. He pointed an accusatory finger at Connor. "You are paying for that bottle, too," he muttered, though he made sure to keep his distance. Connor ignored them completely. He recognized their bravado for what it was. It was a fragile shield. They used loud words and threats to hide their deep insecurity. He had seen the exact same behavior in green recruits before they faced real combat. These men knew nothing about actual conflict. They only knew how to intimidate people who could not fight back. Connor slowly broke his gaze from Richard. He turned his back to the three businessmen. It was a calculated move. It showed total disrespect and a complete lack of fear. He crouched down on one knee in front of Samuel. Samuel looked at the young soldier. The old man's silver hair caught the dim light of the station. His chest still felt damp and cold from the spilled coffee, but his eyes were bright and entirely alert. "You did not have to do this," Samuel said softly. His voice rasped slightly, holding the weight of many hard years. "They have money. Money causes trouble." "They cause the trouble," Connor replied simply. His voice was low and steady. Connor swung his heavy olive-drab backpack off his shoulder. He placed it gently on the concrete floor. He unzipped a small side compartment. He reached inside and pulled out a small, clean microfiber towel. It was standard issue, designed for cleaning optics and gear in the field. Connor held the towel out. He did not wipe the jacket himself. He offered Samuel the dignity of doing it. "Here," Connor said. Samuel hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then, he raised his trembling hand and took the towel. The fabric felt soft and completely dry. He pressed it against his wet olive-green jacket. It absorbed the remaining cold liquid much better than the flimsy paper tissue he used earlier. "Thank you," Samuel said. He looked into Connor's weathered face. He saw the sharp discipline, the quiet strength, and the unmistakable bond of service. "Which branch?" "Navy," Connor answered. He kept his eyes scanning the crowd and the three men behind him, always maintaining his situational awareness. "SEAL teams." Samuel gave a slow, respectful nod. He understood exactly what that meant. "Army," Samuel replied. "Infantry, a long time ago." Connor looked directly into Samuel's eyes. The unspoken connection formed instantly between them. It bridged the gap of decades and different wars. They both knew the true cost of service. They both understood the heavy weight of sacrifice. Connor saw the empty space under the plaid blanket. He knew exactly what kind of hell this old man had survived. "It is an honor to meet you, sir," Connor said quietly. Samuel smiled. It was a small, genuine smile that reached his steel blue eyes. For a brief moment, the cold, noisy train station faded away entirely. Behind them, Richard grew furious. He hated being ignored. He hated seeing the soldier treat the crippled old man with such high respect. It made him feel incredibly small. "Hey," Richard barked. He took a hesitant step forward, stopping well out of arm's reach. "Do not turn your back on me. I am talking to you." Connor did not turn around. He stayed crouched in front of Samuel. He spoke over his shoulder, his voice loud enough for Richard to hear clearly. "Keep your mouth shut until security arrives, or I will close it for you." The absolute certainty in the threat made Richard freeze. He snapped his mouth shut. He crossed his arms tightly over his chest and glared at the broad back of the soldier. The heavy man and the thin man shifted uncomfortably. They all realized they had entirely lost control of the narrative. 10 minutes passed. The crowd of commuters did not disperse. They stood in a wide ring, waiting to see the final outcome. A new train arrived on the opposite platform. The metal doors opened with a loud hiss. A few people rushed onto the train, but the majority chose to stay. They willingly missed their ride home. They wanted to witness justice. They wanted to see the arrogant men face actual consequences. Whispers spread through the crowd. People pointed at Richard and shook their heads in utter disgust. They admired the quiet, towering soldier who bravely stood his ground. Then, the sound of crackling radios echoed down the tiled hallway. Heavy, hurried footsteps approached rapidly. "Make way, step aside, security," a loud voice commanded. The crowd parted reluctantly. 3 men in dark blue uniforms pushed their way through the ring of onlookers. The man leading them was Captain Miller. He was a stocky man in his late 50s with graying hair and a thick mustache. He carried a heavy radio on his belt and wore a look of deep annoyance on his face. 2 younger security guards flanked him, looking tense and ready for a fight. Richard saw the uniforms. His face lit up with absolute triumph. He uncrossed his arms and stepped forward quickly. He pointed a long, accusatory finger directly at Connor's back. "Captain," Richard called out loudly. He injected fake relief and deep distress into his voice. "Thank God you are here. This maniac just threatened my life. He is completely unhinged. Arrest him immediately." Connor did not rush to defend himself. He stood up slowly. He picked up his military backpack and slung it effortlessly over one shoulder. He turned around to face the approaching security guards. He kept his hands perfectly visible and empty. He kept his face blank, his posture relaxed but ready. He stood tall, shielding Samuel from the incoming chaos. The stage was set. The arrogant businessman smiled, entirely confident that his wealth and status would easily win the day. Captain Miller pushed past the last row of onlookers. He stopped in the center of the open circle. He rested his heavy hand near the black radio on his belt. The 2 younger guards stood beside him. Their eyes scanned the crowd, looking for the source of the trouble. Richard immediately stepped closer to the captain. He put on a face of extreme distress. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Connor. "Captain," Richard said loudly, "thank God you got here. This man is a complete menace. He threatened to assault me. I want him arrested and removed right now." Captain Miller looked at Richard. He carefully noted the flushed face, the expensive tailored suit, and the strong, sour smell of alcohol. Then, he shifted his gaze to Connor. He saw a tall man standing perfectly still. Connor held a large olive-drab military backpack over one shoulder. He did not look like a random street thug. He looked highly disciplined and completely unbothered by the arrival of station security. "All right, everyone calm down," Captain Miller ordered. His voice was gruff and authoritative. "Nobody is getting arrested until I figure out exactly what is going on here. You claim this man threatened you?" "He absolutely did," Richard insisted. He crossed his arms tightly, feeling his confidence return. "He stepped right into my path and physically intimidated me. My friends can verify everything. We were just walking to catch our train, and this guy tried to start a violent fight for no reason." The heavy man and the thin man nodded quickly in agreement. They wanted the situation resolved immediately so they could escape the angry, judging stares of the surrounding crowd. Connor did not argue with the false accusations. He stood tall and kept his silence. He knew the truth would eventually reveal itself. He kept his eyes focused on the three men, ready to react if they tried to run. Captain Miller let out a long, tired sigh. He dealt with drunk, entitled commuters every single night of the week. He stepped toward Connor, planning to ask for some formal identification. As he moved closer, his line of sight naturally shifted. The broad frame of the young soldier no longer blocked his view of the dark corner. The bright, fluorescent lights of the ceiling illuminated the small space behind the concrete pillar. Captain Miller saw the rusted manual wheelchair. He saw the dark, wet coffee stain on the old olive-green jacket. And then he looked closely at the weathered face of the man sitting in the chair. Captain Miller stopped walking instantly. His heavy black boots skidded slightly on the smooth-tiled floor. He froze entirely in place. The deep annoyance vanished from his face in a split second. His eyes widened in absolute shock. He stared at Samuel, completely ignoring the noise around him. Samuel looked back at the security captain. His steel blue eyes were calm and steady. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of recognition. Richard noticed the sudden pause. He grew highly impatient. "Well?" Richard demanded loudly. "What are you waiting for? Put the cuffs on him, and tell that filthy homeless guy in the chair to get out of the station. He ruined my expensive shoes with his garbage coffee." Captain Miller did not look at Richard. He did not look at Connor. He completely ignored the wealthy businessman's ridiculous demands. Slowly, with deliberate care, Captain Miller reached up. He pulled his dark blue security cap off his head. He held the cap tightly against his chest. He stood up perfectly straight, pulling his shoulders back into a rigid posture of deep, undeniable respect. The two younger security guards looked at their captain in utter confusion. They had never seen him act this way before, especially during a hostile dispute. They looked over at the old man in the wheelchair, trying desperately to understand the situation. Captain Miller took two slow, deliberate steps forward. He stopped just 2 feet in front of Samuel. He bowed his head low, offering a public gesture of profound reverence. "Mr. Hayes," Captain Miller said. His normally gruff voice suddenly sounded incredibly gentle and full of sorrow. "I am so incredibly sorry. I did not know it was you sitting over here in the dark." Samuel offered a faint, tired smile. "It is all right, Captain. It is a very busy night. Accidents happen." Richard dropped his arms to his sides. His jaw fell open in shock. He looked at the captain, then at the old man, completely bewildered by the sudden change in dynamics. "What are you doing?" Richard shouted. "Why are you apologizing to him? I am the victim here. He assaulted me." Captain Miller slowly raised his head. He put his blue cap back on. He turned his heavy body to face Richard. The deep respect he just showed Samuel was instantly replaced by a look of pure, burning fury. The captain stepped directly toward Richard, forcing the arrogant businessman to take a quick step backward in fear. "You have absolutely no idea who you are talking to, do you?" Captain Miller asked. His voice echoed powerfully through the silent station. He spoke loud enough for every single commuter on the platform to hear. Richard swallowed hard. The remaining liquid confidence drained rapidly from his face. "He is just an old beggar taking up space," Richard stammered weakly. "His name is Samuel Hayes," Captain Miller boomed. He pointed a firm, angry finger at the wheelchair. "He is not a beggar. He is a highly decorated combat veteran, and he is an absolute hero of this city." The large crowd leaned in closer, hanging silently on every single word the captain spoke. 12 years ago," Captain Miller continued, his voice ringing with absolute clarity and deep emotion, "a 7-year-old girl slipped on the ice right on that platform over there. She fell directly onto the tracks. The evening express train was coming in at full speed. Everyone stood here and screamed in terror. Everyone froze in place, except him." Captain Miller pointed at Samuel again. He did not hesitate for a single second. He jumped down onto those deadly tracks. He threw that little girl out of the way. He saved her life, but he did not have enough time to pull himself back up. The massive station fell so completely quiet that the low hum of the electrical lights sounded incredibly loud. The commuters stared at Samuel with wide, amazed eyes. Captain Miller took another aggressive step toward Richard. The businessman looked utterly terrified now. "The train crushed his legs," Captain Miller stated coldly. "He gave up his own legs so a young child could live to see her parents again. He earned the right to sit anywhere he wants in this station. He earned the absolute respect of every single person who walks through these doors." Richard turned incredibly pale. All the color washed entirely out of his face. He looked like he was going to be physically sick. He looked down at his slightly stained leather shoes, then looked slowly at the empty space under Samuel's plaid blanket. The crushing, undeniable weight of his own terrible arrogance finally hit him. He had assaulted and mocked a man who possessed more courage in his little finger than Richard would ever possess in his entire life. The heavy man and the thin man backed far away from Richard. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with him anymore. They stared at the concrete floor, completely ashamed of their own actions. The crowd of commuters finally erupted. They did not cheer. They voiced their absolute disgust for the 3 wealthy businessmen. People shouted angry insults. A man in the back yelled for the real police to come and arrest Richard. The public tide had fully turned against the cowardly bullies. Connor stood quietly to the side. He watched the incredible scene unfold with deep, quiet satisfaction. He looked at Samuel, finally seeing the true extent of the old soldier's immense bravery. Connor felt a massive surge of pride swell in his chest. He knew he had defended the right man. Richard stood completely frozen in the center of the angry crowd. He had money, he had corporate power, and he had an expensive suit. But in that exact moment, under the bright lights of the Chicago subway station, he realized he was absolutely nothing. Richard did not say another word. His mouth hung open, but no sound came out. The heavy reality of his actions finally crushed his arrogant spirit. He looked around the circle of commuters. He saw only anger and disgust in their eyes. The wealthy executive suddenly looked very small. Captain Miller turned to his 2 younger security guards. He pointed a firm finger at the 3 businessmen. "Escort these men out of the station immediately," Captain Miller ordered. His voice left absolutely no room for argument. "If they resist, call the city police. They are permanently banned from using this transit system." The 2 guards stepped forward quickly. They grabbed Richard by the arms. The tall man did not fight back. He kept his head down, staring at his expensive leather shoes. The heavy man and the thin man followed closely behind him. They walked through the crowd in total silence. The commuters parted to let them through, but they did not hide their contempt. People clapped loudly as the security guards marched the bullies toward the exit stairs. The sound of applause echoed off the tiled walls, celebrating the sudden return of justice. Captain Miller turned back to Samuel. He adjusted his blue cap. "I will file a full report on this, Mr. Hayes. You will not have to deal with those fools ever again." Samuel nodded slowly. "Thank you, Captain. You did a good job today." The captain smiled warmly, gave a small bow of his head, and walked away to resume his patrol. The crowd slowly began to disperse. The heavy tension in the air completely evaporated. People went back to looking at their phones and waiting for their trains. The station returned to its normal, chaotic rhythm. Connor bent down and picked up his heavy military backpack. He looked at the old wall clock hanging above the platform. "Your train will be here in 5 minutes, sir," Connor said. He looked down at the dark, cold stain still covering Samuel's jacket. "Wait right here." Connor turned and jogged up the concrete stairs. He moved with incredible speed despite the heavy pack on his shoulders. He reached the upper concourse and found the small coffee kiosk. He ordered a large black coffee. He paid the cashier quickly and rushed back down the stairs to the platform. Samuel sat quietly in his corner. He felt a deep sense of peace. The humiliation of the attack had completely washed away. He watched the young soldier return. Connor walked over and carefully handed the steaming paper cup to Samuel. "Here you go, sir," Connor said. "Black, just the way they make it in the mess hall." Samuel took the warm cup with both hands. The heat seeped into his cold, stiff fingers. He brought the cup to his lips and took a slow sip. The fresh coffee tasted incredibly good. It warmed his chest and chased away the lingering winter chill. "Thank you, son," Samuel said. He looked up at Connor's weathered face. "You have a good heart. Your commanding officers must be proud." Connor shifted his weight slightly. He looked down at the old veteran. "They taught me to protect those who cannot protect themselves. You taught them that lesson first." Samuel smiled. He looked down at the empty space under his plaid blanket. He remembered the terrified face of the little girl on the tracks 12 years ago. He remembered the deafening roar of the train. He had never regretted his decision. He had traded his legs for a life. It was a soldier's trade. "We do what we have to do," Samuel said quietly. "We hold the line." "Yes, sir," Connor agreed. "We hold the line." The loud mechanical screech of steel wheels echoed through the tunnel. The late train finally arrived at the station. The massive metal doors slid open with a sharp hiss. A rush of warm air blew out from the train cars. The remaining commuters hurried on board. "That is my ride," Samuel said. He gripped the metal wheels of his chair, preparing to push himself toward the open doors. Connor stepped forward immediately. He placed his strong hands on the handles of the wheelchair. "Allow me, sir." Samuel did not protest. He let the young soldier push his chair across the platform. Connor maneuvered the chair carefully over the small gap between the platform and the train. He positioned Samuel safely inside the warm car, near the priority seating area. Connor stepped back out onto the platform. The automated voice announced that the doors were about to close. Connor stood directly in front of the open doors. He looked at Samuel sitting quietly inside the train. The old man held his new cup of coffee, looking back at the young soldier. Connor dropped his heavy backpack to the floor. He stood perfectly straight. He brought his heels together with a sharp, crisp snap. He pulled his shoulders back, expanding his broad chest. He raised his right hand in a swift, precise motion. His fingertips touched the edge of his eyebrow. It was a perfect textbook military salute. It contained absolute respect, deep gratitude, and a profound, silent understanding between two warriors. Inside the train, Samuel saw the salute. His eyes widened slightly. A wave of immense pride washed over his tired face. He pushed his coffee cup to the side. He planted his trembling hands firmly on the armrests of his wheelchair. With a massive effort, Samuel pushed his chest forward. He forced his aging spine to straighten. He sat as tall and as proud as he possibly could. Slowly, Samuel raised his own right hand. His fingers shook slightly, but the movement was deliberate and strong. He returned the salute with the exact same fierce dignity he had carried into battle decades ago. The two men held the salute for a long, silent moment. The noisy subway station faded away entirely. They were the only two people left in the world. The train doors slid shut, breaking the connection. The heavy metal train lurched forward. It picked up speed, rushing out of the station and disappearing into the dark tunnel. Connor lowered his hand. He picked up his backpack, turned around, and walked away into the cold Chicago night.
Sometimes true courage isn't found on a distant battlefield. It's found in a quiet subway station when someone simply chooses not to look away. We walk past quiet heroes every single day, completely forgetting the heavy price they paid for the peace we enjoy. The young Navy SEAL Connor didn't need to raise his fist or start a violent fight to bring justice. He just needed to stand his ground and do what was right. And Mr. Hedges, the old veteran, showed us that true dignity is something others can never take away from you, no matter how cruel or arrogant they are. Honestly, this story is a powerful reminder that respect is earned through sacrifice, and it's our job to protect the people who once protected us. We all have the power to be a shield for someone else when they need it most. If this story touched your heart today, please share it with your friends and family to honor all of our brave veterans. Let me know what you think in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this one. May God bless you and your loved ones, and may He always protect the brave men and women serving our country. If you believe in honoring our everyday heroes, please drop an amen in the comments.